Dr. Padmini Roy Murray, and also Farah Yamin.
Thank
I'll
you.
start with introducing the daily comparatives to you, and then after that, Abhishek will take over and introduce the speakers, and then he will hand over the floor to you. Daily Comparatist is a group of students and faculty members of the Department of Comparative Indian Literature. The department is Indian Literature, Indian Languages and Literary Studies of Delhi University. So while there has been a course of comparative Indian literature for long, and we have been trying to understand the nature of Indian literature in connection to each other, and later we started having more focus on the nature of Indian literary culture. So we formed this group in 2009, where we started going beyond the institutional platforms and create a platform of our own, because we now believe that there is a daily school of looking at comparative literature. As part of that, we have now various subgroups where our scholars and teachers are doing researches and publishing, and also organizing conferences and webinars. So we have like subgroups like on COVID research, cultural response to COVID-19. We have subgroup on comparative manuscriptology. This is the newest subgroup we have, which is on digital humanities. As COVID-19 has pushed us into this digital era more than we were open to it earlier in the pre-COVID situation. I mean, it has always been there. I mean, it has been there for long, but now it has become an essential part of our education and also self. So we are sure there would be questions which would be ontological and epistemological, or how these digital humanities is forming our existence and how to address that. Today's session is primarily about digital archiving, because for each subgroup, we have one project of archiving various material. We have already started archiving COVID-19 cultural response data. And from that, we already are coming up with wonderful observations. Just yesterday, we had a webinar where 3 speakers worked on the data, and they came out very interesting observation with very interesting insight on how Indian Muslims have responded to COVID-19. So I welcome you to this platform, and I hope this won't be the last time we would be interacting. We really need your guidance and support for opening up ourselves to the understanding of digital archiving and also digital humanities. Thanks a lot. Now I request Abhishek, who is leading this subgroup on digital humanities, to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone, and I welcome you all to this introductory lecture on digital archiving. So today we are kind of joined by 2 special guests, Dr. Padmini Murray and Farah Yamin. So Dr. Padmini Murray has completed her PhD from University of Edinburgh, and she is the founder of Design Beku, a collective that emerged from a desire to explore how technology and design can be decolonial, local, and ethical. Dr. Padmini established the first degree level digital humanities program in India at the Srishti Institute of Art and Design and Technology, where she was the course director from 2016 to 18. And she was the recipient of the Arts and Humanities Research Council Unbox Fellowship and the co-investigator with Claire Squares on the book Unbound, also funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. She is currently the co-investigator on Gendering the Smart City with Professor Ayona Datta and the digital lead on 2 Centuries of Indian Print, a project in collaboration with British Library and Jadavpur University. She's also served as a trustee for Wikimedia UK from 2013 to 14 and led a research project on platform governance and designs for Xtep Foundation in 2018. And we also have with us Farah Yamin, who's a consultant researcher at NYU, and she started out as a filmmaker but discovered it was not her calling and moved to public histories and digital archiving. Her public history works deal with diverse subjects, cultural geographies, and the individual person, and democratic movements, personal histories of journalism, and lately food. So I'm expecting that today Padmini ma'am will be walking us through her own project on Design BQ on COVID-19 response, which is a very interesting one for you to check out. And I'll post the URL in the this thing chat. And also we are kind of all digital natives here, so White has to kind of walk us through the basics of digital archiving as well. So over to you, ma'am.
Right, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. This is, I should say, this is very informal. I'm hoping that this can be more conversation and a way to kind of wayfind together rather than a kind of formal workshop. And I think some of my reason for actually taking that approach is I think that there's a lot of kind of thinking that we need to do kind of collaboratively to kind of understand the sorts of archiving that people are doing, the kind of content that they're archiving, all of which is fairly unique to this context and to India as well. So, even though there's fantastic archiving and public history work that's been done in India for a good while now, I think especially when it comes to the digital, we're still having to think our way through. So I do want to, at the very outset, say that when, hey, hey Farah, I love the way we're actually matching. This was not planned, everyone. But anyway, so what I was going to say was, when I say that we're talking about the digital, I want to kind of distinguish between digital archiving, which is using the digital as a space to archive, to distinguish that from archiving born digital material, right? So so say for example, a meme is a born digital material. It doesn't have a print counterpart. It doesn't have a physical counterpart. So just to kind of, I know that we will be using these terms maybe slightly interchangeably, but do please kind of intervene, put up your hand or whatever if there's some confusion as to which we mean. I'm very glad to have Farah, who is a good friend and a fantastic archivist. And I just think that it would be really great to have her in the room because she has considerable experience in this space. And she and I kind of often muddle through these questions together. So I just felt it would be wonderful to have her here. I think there are some other public history archivist friends who might be joining us. And if they're in the room, I might kind of call upon them to kind of say maybe a little bit about their own projects. I think one reason why I kind of wanted this to be informal is also that most of us seem to work, when we kind of create archives, seem to work outside an institutional space. Of course, there are centers that do archiving. So the Center for Public History at Shrishti, which is where I actually kind of started this kind of work. Farah has worked with the Center for Community Histories at Ambedkar. There are obviously kind of institutional spaces that do this. But I think increasingly, just because of the profusion of digital material that's out there, a lot of us, like the students that wrote to me, have been just doing this by themselves, just collecting material, and then kind of wondering what to do with it, basically. And I think there are kind of several concerning questions that kind of come up when we archive. And I think maybe we can just kick off by saying something. If maybe in fact the people who wrote to me, the students originally and anybody else, if you are working on an archive by yourself, which is not kind of meant for an institution or a kind of funded project for an institution, I think what might be useful for both me and Farah to understand is that who is this archive for? When you are building this archive, who is your main audience? Right? Have you thought about an audience? I mean, you may not have. You may have just decided to kind of start collecting without an audience in mind. But and also, kind of, what is the purpose of that archive? Is it meant to be? Is it meant to be external? Is it meant to be outward facing? Is it meant for a public audience? Or is it meant just as a record, as a repository of the cultural record? So there are various ways in which one can envision an archive, right? And all of these are also overlapping categories. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be exclusive. So maybe if the Delhi Comparatist group, I mean, if you want to say maybe a little bit about how you came to conceive of this archive, then that would be useful for us and anybody else who might be working on their own archives and kind of wants to kind of learn more. Abhishek, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I was not ready for that, but I think, yeah, this would be
Sure.
good. Because our training, particularly in literary disciplines in India, are primarily the training through books. And then other cultural material when we compare with other cultural materials. Now, for example, say in our department, Professor T.S. Satyanath introduced us 10 to 15 years back to comparative cultural studies, particularly intermediate studies. So we were looking at performances and literature and other forms of art. But we really didn't plan of creating a digital archive at that moment. It started, Satyanath himself has created archives for his personal uses, has guided students to create archive. Those are not primarily digital material, but digital archiving. This whole thought of archiving COVID data came when the first lockdown happened, because there were so many memes, etc. And also that was the moment when we were pushed to our homes and we had to contact people from only home and through online only. So digitality became a reality which changed, I think, quite a few things that we had assumed earlier. For example, the idea of personal and private has changed. It is I think, it has changed forever now. So we started archiving, but in the beginning, it was just a WhatsApp group which we used, and we started putting data in that WhatsApp group. Then we developed a format, an Excel sheet, in which there were various categories into which we will be uploading the data and also start categorizing the data and the information about data. So far, we have done only this much. So your lecture is going to be the first lecture or first training, except one or two of our young scholars who have gone through some training in workshops in other universities. This is going to be the first one. Yeah, and I'm really happy that we have as the first speaker, we have you who introduced this in at the degree level for the first time in India.
Thank you.
I don't know whether anyone else would like to discuss on this. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Does anybody else want to kind of tell us about any kind of initiatives that they're leading or doing or hoping to do even, I mean?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
initially, like when we collected the material, what we kind of noticed was like during this particular phase of lockdown, we were seeing an increased amount of digitally born material that you were like seeing. And it was very interesting because, for example, for every response, like, related to Tablighi Jamaat, or if it's a cultural thing which is coming from. So particularly because I also follow a lot of meme channels from like Kerala. So I could see a lot of the politics being reflected in the memes. So it was like this kind of idea of memes representing a certain amount of angst that people have, and it's like they kind of want to like talk back to the center. That kind of idea was very interesting to me. So at this particular stage, we were just kind of putting it all together on an Excel sheet. So just to see what all we have. And I thought in the future, this could also become like a resource for people who want to kind of, let's say, look at, this responses. And if you kind of categorize it by like a chronology in the sense that, from April to like, September, like, so you'll be able to kind of see what are the kind of responses and which are coming from, different places on different parts of the country. And we're not just kind of at the level of data collection, we've not just limited ourselves to just India. We have kind of also recorded some responses from outside India. So I thought, there was a lot of potential in terms of kind of creating a resource of this material. So
Fantastic. So yes, that's helpful that you wanted it to be a resource. So just as an aside, we have with us one of my colleagues from Design Beku, Paul Anthony George, who actually works, his PhD is on memes, and he focuses on Madhu memes. So he's in the room. So in case you have any burning questions, I'm sure he can also kind of help out with that. So maybe we can just kind of then kick off by, and Farah, if you're happy to kind of step in, maybe kick off just kind of talking about metadata and what metadata is, why is it essential for any kind of resource, be that external or internal facing. So yeah, so Farah, if you want to start off, and I can continue.
In fact, Padmini shared with me the sheet that you guys had developed, and that's a very good start actually, because you have made sure that you have put in the resources and where they came from and what dates you collected it on, and knowing why you're building an archive and why you're building a collection is very important, because sometimes simply through the volume of data, we want to put it into a collection or an archive, but we don't know what to do with it or where to go with it. Oh, thank you. Oh, can you share the screen control with me so I can scroll through? Somebody needs to be muted. Can I?
I need to make you a host. Just give me a sec.
Do you? Oh, okay. I mean,
I can give you screen control, right?
Or I can simply share the screen. I have it open. Okay, just a second. Host disable attendee screen sharing.
Oh no.
Okay, never mind. That's fine. So okay,
I'll share it anyway, and I can scroll. Tell me to scroll when you want me to scroll.
Yeah, that sounds like a very, very classical PPT. Please, next slide. Right, so I think all of us know what metadata is, which is data about data, and that is the most overused definition of data. But why do we use metadata is important. Can we go to that dataset slide? Yeah, thank you. So there are some standards of how we describe data across, and there are various international standards of describing data. And what describing data does is, when you're building a resource to look at, for instance, your current purpose is to build a resource to look at responses to COVID, right? So when you're building a resource, it is important that you build a resource that everybody has a language to access. For instance, metadata is a language of accessing data. Okay, so if you are speaking in English and I'm speaking in Malayalam, and then both of us are trying to interact, it doesn't happen. But metadata makes data accessible, because there are certain things I expect to be in the metadata. For instance, I will always expect a title or a description to be there. I will always expect a date to be there. I will expect an author or a creator name to be there. So there are certain things I expect of that data, and through that I can reuse that data and I can repurpose it to my own purposes. So for instance, while you are looking at responses, I might simply be looking at the frequency of how often Tablighi Jamaat was talked about on a Facebook post, or why a certain creator of how many times a certain creator of a post talked about the Tablighi Jamaat, right? So then we also talk about sub-subject, we subcategorize, and which is why it's also important to tag in metadata. Tagging becomes very important for searching through data. So Padmini, can you go to the file names?
You have control now. So
I
should
do?
be able to share. Yes.
Let me see. I don't think I have control.
Oh, it says that you're a host.
Story of my life.
Okay, I'll do it. Give me a sec. Okay, what do you want?
I want to be able to scroll to the file names. Scroll left. Yeah. I should be able to control. You gave me control. Have I not accepted control? For the left, Padmini, towards the file names, which is on the column A. You're at column B, right? So one way to make data, actually, well, since we are talking about metadata, we will talk about file naming later. But one way to make data more searchable is through file naming descriptively. It is, I know it's helpful because you don't lose track when you just name files through numbers. But when you're building an archive and when you're building metadata, you're always thinking in terms of what if the next person comes in. So your group currently knows exactly what they're talking about and what they're looking at, and this is the purpose of your research. But I might come to the same archive, the same collection with a completely different purpose. And as a person who has no idea why you were collecting or making that collection, I should still be able to access your archive and be able to make sense out of it. I might be looking at the aesthetics of COVID responses in on social media, and that might be what I am looking at, and not what you have been looking at all. But suppose if you were to use, let me choose one. Can somebody see my? Oh yeah, nobody can see my my mouse anyway. So say immunity boosters and COVID, and maybe I am looking at the images that people have used of immunity boosters. Maybe they have used tulsi, maybe they have used haldi, and I am doing a paper.
Out is not what they're looking for.
Sorry, is somebody talking?
मैडम लड़कियां है ये
Hello?
हाँ हम लड़कियां ही हैं, आप कौन हैं?
Farah, can you try sharing your screen because you are a host?
I will do that. I will just do that.
And also, can somebody lock the Google Doc? Because Abhishek, maybe can you just lock it so that other people can't write on it?
Okay, fine.
Thanks.
Right. So I'm going to share the doc that I have. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Oh, sorry. Share. Yeah, here we are.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Right. So for instance, here in where were we? We were discussing this one. Mass. Oh, look, you have one. If I want to do aesthetic, there is called mass decorated by Madhubani paintings. Maybe I just want to look at mass as the next person who comes down, and I am an entrepreneur who wants to study the market and see what kind of mass designs are out there, and I want to look at your archive. I want to be able to search through your archive, and you have a very good category, which is lockdown masks, right? COVID-19 masks. What we need to do here, for instance, see, health is something that you've used consistently, which is good. The best thing, a very important thing to do when you're discussing metadata is also to develop a metadata vocabulary. And you agree on a certain kind of metadata to be used, so that even if there are 15 or 20 of you collecting data, you know that there are certain terminologies that will be used consistently. And if there are words, say, from a different language that you're going to be transliterating, then you agree on a spelling. Because when I am searching, I will be using one spelling, and all those items should turn up as when I'm looking for something. So see, for instance, here you have done COVID-19 masks, and this says a police officer wearing a COVID-shaped helmet and shield. You can still link this to a COVID-19 mask instead of just the lockdown, and then these two things will turn up together, right? So the idea is to link as many items to each other so that the archive speaks to as many people as possible. It is not going to be possible for you to preempt every kind of researcher that is going to come to your archive. But the more rich you make your metadata, the more use your archive will see, and the more longevity you ensure for your archive. Handing over to you, Padmini.
Great, thank you. So yes, absolutely. And I think one kind of important thing that Farah kind of gestured at is this idea of interoperability, right? So in an ideal world, you should, so at the moment, say, for example, obviously your archival material is in a spreadsheet. And somebody else who opens a CSV file will be able to kind of access your data set without any problems. But you also want to be able to carry over kind of the metadata, etc., to other archives if need be, and have archives speak to each other. So when Farah's talking about, the way we describe content in the archive, what that's actually doing is it's giving a narrative, right? And so now this is why writing metadata is actually quite an interesting, I mean, depending on how geeky you are about these things, writing metadata can be quite an interesting undertaking, because how you describe material comes from, or rather shaped by your location. So say, for example, and this is something, a conversation that is kind of ongoing, kind of raging really in archivist circles, is that, say, for example, I have an archive of, say, indigenous material or Dalit material, but I am not from that location. Then first of all, do I even have the right to describe that material? Will I be describing that material in sensitive ways and accurate ways? So I think that, there's definitely, and this is definitely an ongoing conversation about the kind of necessity to have diverse people as part of the archiving process, right? So why we're both kind of emphasizing this idea of interoperability and the fact that this archive, if given to somebody else without any context, should be able to speak for itself, is that hopefully other archivists, when they come to it from a different space, can add a different layer of narrative to it. So it's not only our, say, the definitive terms that we have put on the archive. In an ideal world, it should be quite generative. I'm not sure, is Ranjani, are you in the room? You said that you might be coming. I'm just going to check.
Something at 5:30, so she's missing out on us.
Oh no, okay, all right. So Ranjani is somebody who has been doing some amazing work at Keystone Foundation in the Nilgiris, where they've been working with the indigenous and tribal communities to create environmental archives. And the people kind of working on the archive are from the communities themselves. So one major reason why this is very significant is that the way that, say, relationships with the environment or environmental categories or ways of, kind of interacting with the environment are more often than not, linguistically determined and described differently in different languages. So I think one kind of, challenge that we constantly have working in India is the multilingual nature of kind of the content that we're working with, right? So I know that, most of the material, if I'm not wrong, is English language material, and they're the memes. Is that correct? So no, you've got Hindi as well. So it's majority English, but you've got some kind of scattered. So, what does that mean in terms of, kind of, because it's quite difficult to translate, say, some conceptual categories from one language to another, right? So I think what we're kind of, and I think this is kind of both my and Farah's approach to archiving, is that we kind of think of it more as I guess almost like a crowdsourced initiative rather than a top-down initiative, where the person who, I guess, has created the archive is the only person who describes the archive. Right? We want to kind of work against that. Farah, can you
mask mute? I was muted. Can you mask mute?
Yeah. No, I think you're the host, so now you have to do it. Sorry. Yeah, so it's very necessary that the kind of person or the people who are creating the archive kind of gives it enough context that allows other people to kind of add different layers of narrative onto it. Now, obviously, I think it is important to say at this point that all archives are not necessarily meant for public use. The one very kind of classic case now in the kind of archiving community is there's a content management system called Mukurtu, and Farah, can you just put that in the chat window? And so Mukurtu was built in such a way that it allows Aboriginal communities, so it was built in conjunction with Australian Aboriginal communities. It allows them to create repositories of knowledge, but they can legislate who has access to that knowledge. Because in the Aboriginal community, there are like certain cultural protocols, which mean that certain kind of knowledge is sacred. And therefore, nobody outside their tribes should be allowed to be privy to that knowledge. So what it allows people to do is to kind of create kind of different levels of access to the archive. Now, I'm imagining that this will not be the case maybe with this archive, but I think it is useful to bear in mind, especially if you are archiving material that might be sensitive in some way and possibly harmful to a community. And that, say for example, if you're, cataloging material on the Talbigi Jamaat situation, if, for example, you are cataloging responses from people, so say like an oral history of the response, that kind of material you might want to embargo, or you might want to kind of keep, not make publicly freely available. But what does help is that at the metadata layer, you can make explicit what exists in the archive without explicitly giving people access to the data itself, which is why metadata becomes incredibly important. Another really absolutely kind of essential thing to remember is that most ways in which we think about knowledge, access knowledge in this day and age is search driven. It's very, very unlikely that we already know what we're looking for. I have plenty to say about this in terms of the politics of something like Google and how it hierarchizes knowledge. But that aside, in order for your knowledge to be visible, metadata needs to be kind of very, very robust, right? And so therefore it's not enough to say COVID-19 to describe an artifact, because COVID-19 could be anything, right? So it has to be quite refined and quite detailed, so that it kind of encapsulates and captures the kind of essence of the cultural artifact that you are cataloging. One thing that I noticed on the archive itself, at least the example that was shared with us, and this is I would absolutely, please do not feel bad that I'm pointing this out, because this is a classic problem that many kind of experienced archivists do face, is the kind of conflation between who is in the content. Like, so for example, in here, like that's column M, you have name of the person / people represented in the medium. And then you have the author, writer, and creator. Now, is the creator the person who has created it, or is the person or the institution that archived it, is that the creator of the content? And this is a very slippery question. It happens a lot. I'm really glad to see that some of the examples that you've used are correct. But it's not always very straightforward. So I just wanted to kind of flag that up as something that keeps that can be a bit of a kind of a stumbling block. But yeah, I think it's just something to be kind of aware of. Farah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. If I was actually about to jump in. So while you are thinking of sensitivity and who's represented, and you are archiving from social media, you have to be very careful about how you are taking screenshots. You are taking screenshots of people who you may not necessarily have consent from. These are somebody else has posted this, and you do not have consent to represent that person's name in your archive. The other thing is there are people who like it and some of their names pop up. Let me share an example with you from your, let me just go there, and yeah, let me share Safari with you. Right, so for instance, this screenshot that you have, this may be somebody from your group and you may have consent from him, which is great, that's not a problem. If you do not have consent from him, showing his picture, and in this case he has Che Guevara's picture, which is fine, but if it's an identifiable picture of somebody you do not have consent from, that is not okay to share. So you will have to find a way to eliminate that name or that face, or get consent. And then we have names here of the people who have liked it. You may be aware that people have been targeted for liking posts or sharing some things or receiving some things on WhatsApp group or on Facebook groups. So you have to be very careful of people's privacy. When you're taking a screenshot, you may have the right to take the screenshot of information that is shared publicly. But whether you have the right in this case that, this is an outrightly critical of government post, right? This is a sensitive post. This could land this person in concern in trouble. So the identity of the person and the identity of the people who liked it is sensitive material. and that is something you have to consider. And that also brings us to concerns of IP, that if you are making an archive publicly available and not just using it within your institution to circulate within your group, uh, those IP concerns become important, and you are liable for to be sued if you do not follow them. And Facebook, for instance, has actively has protocols against scraping and saving its data. And Padmini would actually, I think Padmini, you are more equipped to talk about this specific issue.
Sure. Farah, can you just mute everyone? I think
Yep, I am just trying to get back.
Yeah, so exactly. So as Farah was saying, I think one concern about kind of scraping social media is that we do have to be aware of I would say the kind of the corporate limitations set by the corporation, as opposed to what we tend to do. So Facebook, for example, does not allow scraping at all. It is illegal to scrape Facebook, even though there are, if you search, you will find ways to do it, but it is absolutely against the law. Twitter, on the other hand, is actually fairly easy to do, and they are quite all right with you doing it if you provided you do it at in limited numbers. So basically, if Twitter kind of, if it sees that from the same IP address there's a lot of kind of scraping happening, it might revoke your privileges. But it's possible to do this kind of in kind of phases, and that's what many of us who collect hashtags do in order to kind of stay.
I'm
stay
sorry,
clear of
I'm
those
unable
problems.
to mute everybody. Where is that option? Can I? I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No problem. Are you still host?
Looks like it. I have a lot of controls, but I'm not able to mute it. It should be in the mute section, right?
Yeah. Anybody who's better at Zoom than we are?
You could just go to
the
each
participants list
participant.
and mute all.
All right. Okay. I have to go to every part. Can I not just mask?
I think if you go to the participant list, can you? Is there a
All
mute
right.
all option
Yeah. Okay, cool.
from that?
Mute all. Done.
Yeah. Thanks, Maya. Yes, I also muted. Yeah, so Paul, meme and meme archives and the problem of hate. Yes, yeah, okay. So that's a good point. Paul, do you just want to turn on your mic and just kind of maybe explain this a little bit?
Yeah, hi.
Maybe see your face.
I haven't turned my video on. Okay, fine. Hi.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. So I was just mentioning that one of the challenges of creating or trying to capture internet memes is that it's satire that is not always satire, but spreadable content that is coming from a particular context that's already kind of decontextualized in a way to create fun or humor, or it's a pastiche of something else. Now, when you create an archive that is already decontextualized, there is a fair bit of decontextualizing that has happened. What often happens when people who have no idea about that context or have a very small understanding of a larger nuance of that is that the way the algorithms generally pick up extreme content is to amplify extreme content, which is also what happens with archival content as well. So if you don't understand the context, what is humor or satire is often subdued. What is more towards the kind of antagonizing aspect of that content is what is picked up by different audiences. What that eventually perpetuates, and which is why spreadable media is as much content as it is behavior. The behavior also starts getting amplified. So today I know that the trope around, say, in Kerala, Pomone Modi was a hashtag that was very familiar in 2016, following which you had, say, Alavaladi Shaji and what was the other one? Around Yogi Adityanath was also there. So these three tropes exist in some Maluver's on Twitter and to some extent on Instagram. And how memes work is that they have different cycles of appropriation. Now, archives become a very strong place to kind of see evolution of content. And for people who are coming across it the first time, they generally pick up the bits that are amplified, and it becomes sites for amplification for hate speech quite often, which is why when you deal with spreadable media archiving, there's that added anxiety. Yeah, long story.
Great. No, that's really helpful. And actually brings me to my next point, which is, so one of the reasons why I am so upset with Google, I guess, to put it very mildly, is that because of the nature of Google, just because of the interface and how it presents results, which is hierarchical, when one Googles something, you are obviously going to, go to the first page, maybe maximum the second page, but you're not actually going to engage with results later than that. And so the amplification effect that Paul is talking about, that kind of you can see that, kind of very evident in the Google algorithm. So what that means is that so say, at the moment, it's very difficult to kind of think about how somebody might encounter this archive, say, 5-10 years from now, and they might have part of the narrative but not the whole narrative. And so therefore it's incredibly important that the contextual information allows somebody to kind of put the whatever cultural artifact that they may have found by just searching into context. What happens is that the algorithm often kind of decontextualizes material, which makes it very difficult for somebody who does not have a robust sense of what was going on at that time to kind of find more information. So one of the, so this is something that I have for a while now been trying to kind of get people to pay attention to, is that after the death of Rohit Vemuna, there was a huge kind of outpouring of response, especially from young DBA activists on Facebook. Now, even now, if I was to go back, that was only like 2 years ago, if I was to go back, a lot of that material is now gone, but it is incredibly important for the history of the movement. But we don't have, it's not been proactively archived. And if it was to be proactively archived, it would have had to be done kind of in a very kind of sensitive way. It would have to kind of cover a range of languages, and that has not happened. So I think one thing that I do definitely want to say is that social media is not your friend when it comes to archiving. So if you are using any kind of social media to build an archive, be that Instagram, be that Facebook, be that Twitter, all of these social media, I will say, allow you to download your archive. So please do that, every few months. Also because of reasons, as Farah was saying, if for any kind of usage you are not allowed access to your account, that is a whole kind of wealth of information that you will lose. So I think it's important both for our own personal kind of histories, but also for the larger historical record, that we continue to download our archives, because social media, corporations are absolutely within their rights, unfortunately, to withdraw stuff, to kind of pull stuff. And once that disappears, then you no longer have that. Instagram, except, doesn't it, but Paul, just help me, I thought that Instagram does allow you to also download your archive if you
It's not particularly accessible.
Right.
Plus, there is a waiting period which works differently for different people.
Right. Okay.
There's a strong chance that the account that you're afraid will get taken down first, before you download anything.
Right. Yes, and I think that what Paul is saying. I mean, there's a lot of labor involved in creating those kinds of archives, because it basically means that you have to just keep screenshotting, which is just, it's a very kind of arduous task. So, so since so much of the content that one deals with is on social media, I think it's very important that we kind of, flag up these potential kind of issues that happens. One thing that I did want to kind of also flag up with vis-a-vis the particular data set that we're looking at is that the categories, if they are a bit more kind of nuanced, that would be kind of helpful. But I think it's also a question of, almost like the order in which you approach this. Like, are you trying to tell a narrative through your archive, or are you building a narrative through your archive, or are you just archiving and hoping a narrative emerges? All of these are kind of ways in which people have archived. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say any of these are kind of any of these are kind of hard and fast rules, like not to do it this way and to do it that way. It's very much on the nature of the archive. So, but I think just to kind of bear in mind that these are all different kind of ways in which, but I do think that if you are putting together an archive, you should be clear at the outset as to how you want to go about it, and what is the narrative of the archive that you're creating. Yeah, Tejas, thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely, it's okay. So metadata gets scrambled when you are kind of moving oh, 1 minute, we have a, sorry. Yeah, metadata gets scrambled when you are kind of downloading archives, so basically the problem is that you do need to also make a note of the metadata, rather than depending on the social media archive to carry over the metadata, which is incredibly important if you are putting it in an archive for future use, and especially for audiences that are not familiar to you. So I think, one rule of thumb, always kind of think about who is going to use your archive, how far into the future, what kind of use you hope that they will get from it. These are kind of all questions that I think are really important.
And since we are talking about metadata being carried over, let us just quickly run through the logistics of building an archive, which is what I think you guys are interested in.
Yes, please.
What kind of metadata, what are the tools that you can use? And these are things that you'll have to explore on your own. We'll share with you what can be used and what has been used, things that I have worked with, things that I know people are working with. And you will need some tech support, archiving tools. I mean, as Padmini and I discovered while we were doing the homework for today's chat, are not very non-developer friendly. So let's start. Let me just get to do the Dublin Core metadata. So the most common metadata standard that we use and is also internationally acceptable, that does not require you to be familiar with XML, is the Dublin Core metadata standard. Padmini, your kids. Share. Right, can you see this? Padmini, can you share the link for the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative? So this is the metadata standard that is most commonly acceptable internationally. And you will see that most of the things that you have put in your Excel sheet will fall easily under one or the other of the Dublin metadata descriptors. And the Dublin metadata descriptor is not exhaustive. You can add more to it, but these are suggested metadata descriptors that you should have so that anybody internationally can search through your data for. And there are certain descriptors, and the terms are described here. So there is a contributor, there's coverage, there's creator, where you have, in the case where you put author, then there are dates. Then there are, in many archives, especially with social media, there can be a date of creation and a date of accession, the date that you screenshotted it. And with digital material, what happens is that things tend to change a lot. Like even in articles, from the date that you share that article to a different date of access, that article can have changed considerably. So it is useful for you to put in a date of access, because then somebody can go to a cached copy of that information and look for what it was like that day, if the Internet Archive has managed to take a photograph of it. So it will be good for you to look at the Dublin Core metadata format. It's an easy format to follow. It will be, if you ever decide to move to a different platform, the Dublin Core, most archiving tools will allow you to go from Dublin Core to, say, metadata METS or the EID. The encoded archival description and METS. Wait a second, can I Just a second, this Zoom toolbar is on my right. So this, the encoded archival description, this uses XML. Now XML is a fairly simple language to understand. It may not be a very simple language to write, but it is a fairly simple language to understand. And it uses more or less, let me look at, it uses more or less the same descriptions as Dublin Core, but it uses it in a different, in a more structured format. I would want to show you this. But as you can see, you know, this can be intimidating to somebody who is not familiar with coding. And I am not familiar with coding. This is something that I have learned very recently. So, but EAD is very frequently used. What you can do is still use Dublin Core and export to EAD. The same is true of METS, where you know, you have descriptive metadata, then you have administrative metadata, and this is for very, very large collections where you have to know if an item is being shifted from one collection to the other collection. What do we do with the metadata? Where was it before? Where has it gone now? And all of this you might not need at all. But descriptive metadata is something that we all use for even the most basic collections. So I would recommend that you look at these. And for your collection, I would suggest that you use Dublin Core. But the others are also in use and internationally acceptable. In fact, METS is more extensively used by professional archivists. It's a little difficult to get a hang of, but if you familiarize yourself with XML, it's not. I mean, you just have to get over those elements and child elements and things of that, and it will take you maybe a couple of days to be able to read it. You don't necessarily need to know XML, but to be able to read metadata in the METS format. If you can familiarize yourself with XML, you will be able to read it easily. So these are some of the very popular metadata formats that you can use. And then we were looking at possible metadata tools that you can use. And something that we have been using a lot in the humanities is Omeka. And Omeka currently has this iteration called the Omeka S, which is fairly easy to use once you've installed it, but it requires a Linux system. That is the only issue with it. And if you have institutional backing and you have one system with Linux, you can easily install Omeka. And then can you see the CSV import section? You can easily import the Excel that you build. You can easily export it to a CSV format file as opposed to an XLX file. Am I making sense, or should I just, somebody who's listening to
Farah, sorry, Dibbo here. Farah, the comma separated values, would you sort of distinguish why that's a different format than .xls, right? Because that's usually useful.
Right. So comma separated values is what is a usual Excel file is something that is in your blocks, and it's easy for you to read it. A comma separated file is something that is useful for the system to read, because systems read it structurally like that, right? So a CSV import is what most archival data tools will ask for when you're, so it's easy to export from an Excel to a comma separated value, and the system will do it for you. You don't have to worry about it. And then once you've imported it, you have to make sure that what your file names are the same as the file names that you describe in the Excel sheet, in your CSV sheet, so that they tie up with the items that you have imported, right? And then you can edit it, then you can batch edit it, you can redescribe metadata, you can edit your metadata, and you can, Omeka also has this feature of being able to, you being able to exhibit something. So for instance, if you are analyzing the data that you have collected, and then you put it up, if you want to say showcase a certain amount of data and the analysis you have derived from it, instead of showing the whole archive in itself, that is also a possibility for you. So Omeka is something that I have used extensively. It is very useful for all sorts of humanities data because it can deal with videos, it can deal with audio and digitized documents and born digital documents. So that's fairly useful. Then there is archive. But it is useful to have some sort of institutional support, if I may say so. And that is a bit of a, I mean, it's a bit of a nuisance, but it happens because you need some amount of server space. But Omeka is not, I mean, Omeka also does hosted archives, and that is not expensive at all. And as an institution, academic institution, you can ask them for discounts. Then there is archive space, which I have not used. But archive space is also a very popular way of building archives. It has a cleaner interface than Omeka. Swapnili, have you ever used collective access? Because I have seen collective access, but I am not very familiar with collective access myself. So I am actually right now just throwing names at you. And there is something else that we discovered, which is Atom, which is also used by Azim Premji University to handle its own files. Oh wait, archive space is used by NCBS, and I should probably show you the NCBS.
I think Venkat is here as well. So
Hey Venkat. Wait, Venkat is not responding to me. Maybe he's not there.
Hi, sorry, I was just.
So yeah, maybe you should talk about archive space, because you have used both Omeka and archive space, and I have not used archive space myself.
Yeah, we don't want to put you on the spot, Venkat, but if you're happy to just give a brief.
Totally did, man. I'm just the audience here.
No, this is, as you can see, this is a very cooperative.
Yes,
sorry,
I mean,
Venkat.
come on. You're the lead of Milli. You are responsible for this.
We use Archive Space as a catalog management system. We have installed Atom, but we haven't really played with it much. So as you said, Azim Premji knows most about it, at least in the communities that I'm aware of. Actually, and they'd be very interested. They ran a small workshop on it yesterday for a couple of us.
I will share the video.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's going on. So I guess is the question about which one. So there's a big struggle around trying to understand how they're really separated from each other. I would say they largely do the same things. There are a few exceptions. Atom is probably better if you want to also have, a neat way to have digital objects. So since this is a section on digital archiving, you have probably a lot of digital native files, and maybe Atom is just slightly better suited. Archive Space can do it, but it's a slightly more convoluted process. Archive Space is, more, it requires a few more steps to get that going along. Archive Space is actually much better, I find, for using controlled vocabulary, and Farah, you talked about the controlled vocabulary at some point. I mean, at least looking at what kinds of authority files, or if you have place names, subject names, if you want to use specific subjects and you want to prevent ambiguity. For names and such, Archive Space has tools to just import controlled vocabulary. So things like that. Sorry, I'll shut up. I don't know what direction we should take this.
No, please continue, because I just want to discuss the tools that they can use, and then they can eventually decide. I mean, since they are planning to archive, we should at least let them know what tools they can use.
Yeah. So my favorite, I mean, if people are slightly more technically inclined or just can parse material, my favorite thing to suggest to people is to go to Ashley Bloor's website. Has that been spoken here? You guys?
No.
Okay, I'll just quickly look for it. Ashley, you have to make sure you spell it right, because you'll get a very different person. Not be good. But Ashley Bloor is an archivist who has basically put various kinds of asset management systems and archiving tools, and she's basically collected them in one space. Just putting the link on the chat window. So this sort of summarizes some 70 odd tools, which people can just look at and see what works for them and what doesn't. Takes a little bit of time to just look through it, but it is fairly exhaustive. So that's just one quick out there suggestion. But what you had said is something I echo with, using Dublin Core, I mean, we haven't used Omeka in a while, so we'd love to hear your take on it as well.
I have missed a lot of what you've said. Is it the internet on my side or your end?
Yeah, I think it's you, Farah. We could hear him.
Yeah, I mean, I am missing a lot of bits and pieces of what you said, but I heard that you condone my Dublin core usage and Omega. That bit I heard. I think I just want validation.
Yeah. No, I think I mean I heard the initial
So
part
yeah.
that said.
But yeah, I personally, I've seen NCBS's archives and they are they're very neat, and I've also worked with the team that work on the NCBS archives. So definitely ArchiveSpace and Omeka are things I would recommend simply by navigating a lot of archives on Omeka. And and if you try any other tools, we would love to know how that tool worked out for you, because digital archiving in this country is still fairly new, and it's always useful to have more know-how in more specific Indian context. The last thing that I really want to talk about is file naming, which I did touch upon in the beginning of this conversation, but I would just want to make sure that we do address. It's very easy, I know, and I have been tempted to do it very often, is just name file according to numbers, because then you don't lose track of what you're doing. But once you're starting on an archive, it is always useful to define a set of protocols of how you will be naming your file. And certain things that should be there in the file name would always be, say what you name your collection. If this is the Corona collection, that's a stupid name, but whatever you call this collection, please put the collection initials in the file name. Put the year and the dates in the file name, so that it's easier for you to sort through file names later on. And if you're subcategorizing files, like say you're subcategorizing things as Tablighi Jamaat or the Rath Yatra or vaccine related means, then it's useful to have descriptors in the file name, but not very long descriptors, so that it's not very difficult to go through the files. It is one thing to look through metadata, but it's also very important that your file names are descriptive, and instead of just using numerals. And also the kind of data type, like sometimes you would want to describe within your file name, you might have MI, say for moving image, or SI for scanned image, or simply M for manuscripts. You can choose how you name your file. There are also standards described out there that will tell you how to name your file, which are easy and you can just follow them. But try and go for descriptive naming instead of numerical naming entirely. I'm done.
Yes, with some very valuable advice. Thank you. Okay, so there are some questions.
Do you mind? Do you mind if I ask something quickly?
Sure, but there were a few other questions in the chat box. So can I?
Oh, there were. Okay.
Yeah, can I address those first? And then,
certainly. Thank you.
Okay, so I think there was one question from Shreya, who was asking about, if I understand her question correctly. Okay, there's a number of questions. So I think maybe I might start with the last one, which is, do you think we need to address the Babylonian Tower born digital material has birthed as? Okay, so if I understand you correctly, I mean, obviously one huge problem of this moment is that we are, we are assaulted by a tsunami of material, right? So in and of itself is, and I think we haven't actually said this word at all, which is quite astounding, like a curatorial impulse, right? Like, what is it that you as, so the group who are hosting this talk, what was the impulse that got you to archive that particular piece of material over another piece of material, right? Like, looking at what you have on that spreadsheet, I mean, there's surely not only 114 pieces of information that you've come across over the last few months, right? So there is a kind of curatorial impulse for distinguishing and describing and choosing certain material over others. So that's the difference also between, like, one can say, so say for example, I'm collecting hashtags. That's curated by the hashtag, but it's not really differentiating, which can be, which can obviously kind of is quite labor intensive, because if I am, say, collecting hashtags like under COVID-19, in terms of, say, the emotive range of that kind of content, it's a very wide range, right? Like, so it could be starting from anything that's factual to, you know, fake news to, kind of, you know, deaths from COVID. So the thing is that, you know, the kind of the motivation to collect material, especially from born digital spaces, is something that I think it's, I mean, to my mind, it's very, very, I think it's just good practice to actually describe what your methodology, what your collecting methodology was, and to make that quite explicit if you're sharing the archive publicly. So I'll give you an example of this. We did a website around hate crimes a couple of years ago. But it was based on desk research. Now, I think when, you know, there are obviously, you know, there's no way that, you know, a handful of, say, English and Hindi papers can cover all the crimes that are being committed in India. So to just ensure that that kind of robustness is kind of expressed through the site, it was absolutely imperative that the people working, you know, doing the research on the site, for the site, articulated their methodological intentions, motivations. And I think that is actually, I mean, I think that's just good practice, you know, because it helps whoever's coming to your archive to get a good sense of, you know, what it is that you've collected and what is it that you've chosen to leave out, right? Because obviously when you have so much material, that's unavoidable. So I think it's kind of really, I mean, it doesn't make, you know, I think it makes our lives really difficult, but because there's so much material out there. But to go back to what I was saying when we started out, I think that becomes very necessary. And this brings me to the question that Dibbo just asked, that is writing/coding metadata always a narratorial enterprise, or can it be, can it explicitly be about enabling platform or archive interoperability? So what I would say is, well, metadata, if it is written in a certain format, say for example in Dublin Core, then it is inevitably interoperable. So I think, you know, there's no way that one can be done without the other. Yeah, so I think when you're talking about format, then obviously, you know, that's not narratorial. So, you know, this is a photograph versus a video versus whatever. But I don't know, Farah, I don't know whether you differ on this, but I feel that it is impossible to write metadata without connoting some kind of narrative. Because if anything, it's at least telling a narrative about the motivations of the curator.
No, for sure. I mean, there are no impersonal archives, irrespective of however much we want to claim that there are no impersonal archives. We all have an agenda. And, I'm sure if you look through your own the data that you have collected, you will be able to see that there is a political stand you are taking in what you are in with respect to what you are archiving. I mean, you study comparative literature. I'm sure you can see it already. And
Dibbo is not from the conflict group. He's from another space, but yeah.
Or I'm from an IIM, so I have no political stand at all.
Everybody has a political stand. There are zero people who have.
That is a political stand.
None for me. None for me. Okay, Farah, I just wanted to add in. So that was brilliant. So, so I was the associate editor of Electronic Book Review during my PhD years. So in fact, I agree with the idea of, you know, sort of, we were meta tagging at that point of time. So this was the time when EBR was moving from its old interface to its new interface. So what we had to do was basically meta tag those articles. And what we essentially realized was that, as you rightly pointed out, any act of editorial, you know, that comes from textual criticism as well, from Jerome McGann and all of that, is an act of creating an archive according to the editorial intent in that sense of the term, right? So in a country like ours, and I know Maya is here, Venkat is here, so I think it might be also questions to all of them. In a country like ours, which has archives in languages other than English, how do we handle this? That's the sort of...
I think that's the raging archival question, and which is why it would have been helpful if Ranjani was here, because she is doing a lot of archives that are in dialects of Tamil right now at Keystone Foundation. But it is very difficult. So one thing that we have to accept is that most of our archiving tools, not most, I mean, I think currently all of our archiving tools are Anglophonic, and you cannot, I mean, even if you are transliterating, there are people that if you are archiving community knowledge, you are essentially excluding the community from that knowledge. when you're transliterating it to a Roman script or translating it to English. But something that's happening now, and that again, unfortunately, is happening in the West, is that people are trying to create tools for recognizing other languages. But India in itself has so many languages, and these are not languages that are recognized by the West as languages of great importance. But our community knowledge is unfortunately in languages that Google does not recognize. None of the proprietary softwares recognize, and something that we need to work towards is actually building tools for South Asia that recognize dialects and languages in South Asia. That's something that we are all struggling with currently.
And this may be, sorry, this may not to monopolize the conversation. How do you feel about transcribers, all of you, right? Like Padmini, Farah.
About transcribers?
As in,
So just to give very brief context for those who don't know, so I work on a project called 2 Centuries of Indian Print, which is with the British Library, and it's basically a project that's digitizing 200 years of Bengali books. So, and it dates from the 1700s to the early 1900s. Now, obviously, one of the huge challenges with this is that when we started the project, which was in 2015, OCR for Bengali, that's optimal character recognition, was very, very unsophisticated. So what was happening, and because we had quite a large corpus of books, is that we had around, I would say, 95% accuracy, which doesn't sound too bad, but when it, when you're thinking about hundreds and thousands of pages, that actually kind of in terms of quality assurance gets very unwieldy. So, so transcribers definitely changed the game. It's definitely made life easier. But I wouldn't say that it's foolproof at all. So quality assurance is still plays a huge part. So I mean, there are tools, there are OCR tools, and they are useful. But say for things like dialects, for things like say Tulu, which doesn't have a written language, it's just a spoken, that kind of requires a lot of thinking, because then you have to kind of transliterate it maybe into English. It's quite complex. So I mean, I guess the bottom line is we're not optimized. We're not optimized for South Asian languages in a way that's anywhere near as near as it should be. Yeah. Amitabh, sorry.
Yeah, Padmini, I would like to, I mean, it's about the discussion you had just now about one is about curatorial preferences and also about politics or not. So I'd like to share a few things that we have experienced in last few days.
Sure.
First, of course, I agree with Farah that no one is non-political. So Dibaduti's position is a political position. Particularly when it comes to students of social sciences and humanities, being non-political is impossible. You cannot pursue your discipline without being political.
Can I just add in, my tongue was firmly in my cheek when I said that. So
I saw that.
To let you know. Yeah.
So anyway, we had an interesting experience. When we started our primary, of course, given our disciplinary boundaries, our primary urge was or target was to collect social media data, because we would be then getting visual data or say audio-visual data, which we can include in the structure of comparative cultural studies, and we can go ahead. When we started working on that, we have experienced a few things, which I'll just point out. I don't know what the meaning of that would be. I'm still trying to understand. One, we got more information. Most of the memes and cartoons were in either English or Hindi. So when in our last webinar, the project that we are working on, Muslim response to COVID-19 in India, and we had actually, the structure was that we'll have one pan-Indian paper, where actually we'll include Hindi and English memes and cartoons, and we had 3 scholars working on West Bengal, Delhi and Uttar Pradesh, and Delhi and West Bengal, Delhi and Uttar Pradesh, and
Kashmir.
It will come. So 3 areas, 3 states actually. Kashmir, yeah, Anam, yeah, Kashmir. So when I was insisting as a teacher and trained in that old school that you need to remain within your discipline, what we found that they could not trace almost anything in any of the Indian languages. I have a collection of Bengali and Assamese memes, right? So I thought I'll be using that. But when I am going through these memes, it seems Bengali and Assamese memes that I have, these are the only two languages I can read and speak apart from the pan-Indian languages. I found those are not political.
That's interesting.
So the political, because when the group which is working on not on the aestheticization, but on a response of a certain community, it becomes important, it becomes political, of course, given the context we are working on. And we are not finding memes and cartoons in regional, local languages. This is one thing which is which is very interesting for me.
Right.
It might mean one big shift in which languages India consumes and contacts in. Now, when it comes to say making joke about Corona, talking about local issues like flood in Assam, there are local memes. There are memes in Assamese. And these also added to our, a big disciplinary issues. Like, for example, they also did a Google form based and interview based survey of responses. So we reached a point where our survey material is available, but we don't have, okay, one can define culture as Stuart Hall did, right, every day. But even then, being from a discipline of humanities, we need either something audiovisual or performative, something we need. We are not finding from regions. Those were all in Hindi and English.
Yeah, no, I think this is an excellent point, and actually I think again it speaks to some of my angst around Google. So one of the major reasons for this is that search in Indian languages is very unsophisticated. So, what is kind of being thrown up is, often not kind of, representative of what is being produced. So I think that's one problem. The second is metadata for these artifacts in these languages are also, kind of not often robust enough to be picked up by a search because they're not actually created for that. So I'm just going to use a slightly like a parallel example, which is around fake news. So some kind of work that I've done kind of with colleagues around fake news. We've increasingly come up again and again against the fact, which is something that is not talked about enough at all, is that fake news, obviously there is a kind of torrent of fake news that is being generated by, say, news channels or on Twitter, etc., which are pan-Indian kind of occurrences. But fake news in very hyper-local spaces is a complete reality, but it just completely falls under the radar, right? So, we've spoken to, say, communities in Delhi where there are, frontline health workers who have encountered certain very specific kinds of fake news around cures for COVID, which only their neighborhood has only received. Right, it's not necessarily something that's mainstream. Sometimes it's translated. So that is also an interesting thing that we have found, that there's one English language, English language equivalent out there, and then it's been translated into an Indian language. Maybe some facts have been altered during that translation. So I think what you're saying, it's really true, and I think it's very much. I think it's a kind of unfortunate and inevitable consequence of the fact that the language of the internet is English still, right? So in order to do this kind of, unless there are, and Paul can maybe speak a little bit to this, people who position themselves as, say, digital ethnographers, they need to kind of actually, I guess, kind of make quite a proactive effort in order to access those communities. It's not something that they're just going to be able to pick up because it's not visible. So, Paul might join, a meme community on Facebook that specializes in a certain kind of meme to kind of find that material. And then of course there's also the internal algorithms of the corporations themselves. So I mean, Facebook, the way that it mandates, like the way its newsfeed works and what it makes visible. I mean, it obviously has kind of its own kind of algorithmic motivations for doing what it does. So again, visibility is incredibly restricted. So I think this is, I mean, it's a hazard, and that's actually why I was kind of, I was careful to say that you need to say that, you need to kind of imply, or kind of not even imply, sorry, articulate those limitations in your methodology. Because, somebody, again, 5 or 6 years down the line, they'll be like, but why wasn't, say, XYZ there? One way to kind of ensure that, that's ring fenced is to kind of say, these are the limitations of this project, which is very different from, say, the way that we work with historical archives, which is we take an archive, we digitize it, it has a limit, and then we put it up, right? So that's a very distinct difference between social media archiving and kind of more traditional historical material archiving. Okay, so I think we have a lot of questions, and I know we're also kind of running way over time. So I'm just going to quickly try and see if I can answer some of them.
Padmini, I just wanted to add to something that you said.
Yeah, go for it, Paul. Yeah.
So in terms of the representation of languages, and one bit is the perception around what the word meme actually could mean. So in terms of linguistics, the dominant language around the internet may be visually English, but that does not mean that local or hyperlocal languages aren't represented in memes. One example that kind of deters, that kind of shows why there is a dearth of other language memes is also because most of the memes in terms of image macros and videos in India is coming from the film industry. So there is a strong chance that film remixes, if each of these regions don't have their local films, there will be a dearth of content there. But filling in that void is also just basic images from places and narratives that are very specific over there. Now, their representation on the internet depends on a whole range of things, which the algorithm might not be in favor of by default. The other bit is around what the word memes might actually mean, in the sense that we look at memes as spreadable images or spreadable videos, whereas spreadable audios don't generally get the equal kind of due space in terms of archiving. Spreadable audio formats like Bella Ciao's song being adapted constantly across the world is a very interesting way of looking at it. We just kind of overwhelm ourselves with the video aspect of that song, but it's the song that actually spread or caused to spread. And this is true in a couple of different regions in the country as well. For example, the Apatani community in Zero, if you kind of spend time on Facebook with some of their pages, you see that in essence, they don't have a script. They use the English alphabet to kind of communicate the oral aspect of the language. But they still have memes in English using the same linguistic aspects. This should not necessarily only be looked at as an English text-based meme, because it's largely dependent on their language. So this kind of conflation is like very frequent in India. And it shows how, say, Malu community pages recognize that there is a diasporic element to the way memes are communicated. So they switch between Malayalam text as well as English language to kind of use Malu English ways of communicating. So it's not as straightforward once you like kind of are knee deep in it.
No, absolutely.
If you look at TikTok,
that is so true. Yeah,
wait a second, but let me interrupt because Chetan asked us to whether he could ask us a question or not, and then we went on with other questions. And can we please please answer Chetan's questions first and then move on to others?
Okay, wait. Can we actually address Rohan's question, because it's pertinent to what Paul has just finished saying?
Rohan is also part of our research scholars, so.
Right. So, so he was kind of asking about attending sensitively to the identity of the content creator while archiving social media posts. Can you shed more light on this for tweets from handles that are the center of top conversations and hashtags? So, somebody who's done really amazing work on this is somebody called Sanjeev Khurana. A lot of his research is available online. What he's done, and also Joyjeet from Microsoft Research. I'll put both of these references into the chat box. But basically, what they've done is, through looking at kind of top tweeters, people who have kind of risen to the top of certain conversations through around certain hashtags. What they've both tried to kind of demonstrate is the kind of network relationship between, you know, Twitter, people on Twitter, and kind of what that means in terms of, you know, status on the site. You know, there's been some related work, in fact, around caste kind of formations on Twitter. You know, so I mean, unsurprisingly, one sees that, you know, dominant caste people are unlikely to kind of amplify kind of non-dominant caste voices, even if they're of the same political party or whatever the case may be. So around that, I think, as far as I know, it's actually legitimate to name handles, because Twitter is a public facing platform, right? So on Twitter, it's fine. That's not a problem. I actually don't even think that it is. I don't know, Farah, tell me what you think, Paul. Also,
I mean, I would say that somebody would actively share an opinion on Twitter as a public thing that is meant essentially for sharing.
Yeah.
I would say that's fine. But there would be people who will have liked it or retweeted it, and if those names show up, that's a problem.
Exactly.
So you have to be careful of who has responded to that versus who has put out the tweet.
Which is different from Facebook or Instagram, because you can, you know, it's obviously, at least assume that your content is only being shared with a certain audience. You have chosen the audience, which with Twitter is not a reality. So, you know, it doesn't matter. What you said around kind of looking at the top conversations, and you're afraid that you might end up amplifying hate or worse, or, well, the running into trouble, I'm afraid I can't really say anything about. But I mean, it depends where you are publishing this. Is this for your private use? Are you actually publishing this as a live archive? It is possible for anybody, if they know how, just like you, to collect Twitter hashtags. So that is not going to polarize conversation unless you retweet it. But otherwise, there is no way that that's going to have an impact on what already exists. So I wouldn't worry about that. The way that images, memes, videos work in tweets, that actually takes us back to what Tejas was saying earlier. Metadata gets scrambled. So you have to kind of be quite careful about, and with memes, this is almost, you know, next to impossible, right? Like to kind of backlink and kind of see, you know, what the original use or the original tweet was anyway. If you are, I'm not quite sure whether this is what you're asking in the question, but are you also asking like how to extract that kind of visual content from a tweet, or are you asking how that might be archived? Is that, like, are you asking whether that should be archived differently from a tweet?
Hi.
Hi.
I want to understand how when a tweet is basically a textual genre, right?
Sure.
But with 4G, and recently we have seen that the audiovisual content, Twitter has allowed users to embed audiovisual content into the textual content. So when a user embeds a video or a meme or any dynamic content into a static or textual content, how does it affect the genre of the tweet itself? How does it affect how the user, the viewer interacts with that tweet? How does the user interact with the tweet that has dynamic, embedded content which is dynamic, vis-a-vis tweets which do not have such content?
Are you asking this from an archival point of view, or just in terms of user interaction?
I am mostly interested in user interaction.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you correctly, I mean, they would obviously, I mean, they would see the tweet, and if it's like, say, a video, now of course Twitter has this very irritating autoplay feature. I mean, it'll play it. But yeah, but if they're going to retweet it, obviously it's not going to separate out visual and textual content, right? Like the whole tweet will be shared. Is that what you're asking?
Not exactly. I mean, you are asking in terms of the way it is archived. I mean, when you pull, when tag, I use tags for it. So what I received was the tweets with the link to the tweets where I can find the images and the video or whatever was embedded within the textual media. But what I want to understand that when a person tweets out tweets out textual content with and embeds dynamic content into that tweet, how does it kind of affects the interaction of the users with that tweet? Because because it's not similar to Twitter is a microblogging site, but then the user interactivity gets enhanced because there is embedded dynamic media in the textual content. So is there any kind of theoretical literature on that kind of looks at?
I see. Okay. I don't know whether. Wait, let me think. Paul, any pointers about shared content and kind of?
There's actually a fair bit of like, you will find papers that talk about how social media shares and whether certain things get more likes or not. So there'll be an analysis of that, and I can look them up and maybe send it to you if you drop your email to me.
Yeah, exactly.
But I can't. Yeah.
Because what I've been trying to understand through the hashtags that I've received is particularly the instance where the tweet has an embedded content, a dynamic content, which is a video. It gets more traction, and around that conversation starts, and then it kind of spirals into the hashtag that it becomes. So
wait. Yes and no. Yes and no, because it depends. Like, so whoever's sharing it, like the original poster, so to speak, might be sharing it with a hashtag. So that it's not like the hashtag emerges from content.
So I think he's asking two things. One is that when a tweet is shared with dynamic content, by which I think he means images and videos, it gets more eyeballs, and therefore the hashtag that it is originally shared with becomes popular, and then that hashtag takes over versus something that is shared just as a content. I mean, that may or may not be true depending on who tweets it. What kind of content is it? Whether it caters to a specific kind of political agenda that is currently in interest. So there would be multiple. I think there would be.
And also, I would also add to this that the Twitter trending, what it claims is trending.
It's also a Twitter.
It's a claim that Twitter is making. It's not at all a realistic. I mean, if you even just look at the numbers of, say, trending topic, it varies from anything from 1,125 tweets to something in the millions. I mean, there is absolutely no. I really wouldn't put any kind of.
Twitter also has a political agenda, so you have to look at that.
Exactly. So, but yeah, I think what Farah is saying is very valuable about who tweeted it, and that's exactly the kind of space that Sanjeev and Joyjeet's work is in. So I'll put those two papers in the chat box, and hopefully that will help. I don't know whether, I don't think Sanjeev has looked specifically at visual content in tweets and the relationship that has to sharing, but definitely has looked at who's sharing and how that impacts. Because if like any cursory use of Twitter, that latest tweets, to choose between seeing latest tweets and what Twitter decides to show you is already something, a curation that Twitter is doing for you.
In fact, the timing of the tweet is also important, whether you tweet in the evening or in the morning, and there are people who are Twitter actually know exactly when to post so that they get maximum eyeballs. So all of those things are important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I hope that's helpful, Rohan. I know that's not a definitive answer, but we'll both share what we
can
say.
share papers.
There was Chetan.
Chetan wants to know where he can get more grants for. He's archived more than 20,000. If we knew where we could get more money. We'll be there.
Yeah.
But you can check with Intact, and if you can look at, I mean, if you can identify themes in the types of documents you're digitizing, then you can identify institutions that are working with, that are interested in specific themes. Say one theme could be food, one theme could be democratic movements, one thing could be, historical personalities, and then people who are interested in those specific themes, you can propose that to those institutions. But I cannot broadly recommend an institution that will give you more money for digitizing. I mean, it's amazing, the work you've done is very impressive, but yeah, money is hard to come by, especially in these COVID days.
But you might, in your experience, know people who have received such grants, and those institutions, if you know their names, if you can throw them in, then I can look them up. Like just Maya sent me something for UCLA.
I know that in India, Intact does it, but Intact doesn't have big grants.
And India Foundation for the Arts also, no?
Yeah, IFA also does it.
Arcadia Foundation,
You can also look
which is
at...
also the source of money for British.
You can also look at the Murthy Classical Library if you have classical texts. But yeah, I mean, you have to have, among your 20,000 books, or if there are more that you have to do, there are books that you can identify a specific reason for digitizing them, except for the sheer love of digitizing, which I completely identify with. You have a better chance of securing a grant. But you can look at Intact. Intact is always interested in digitizing things, even though they don't have very big grants. So that could be an option.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, Chetan, I have not been funded by anybody by the British Library. So,
yeah, I mean, in fact, most of us have been, British Library has been our bread and butter.
I mean, obviously, when I was in the UK, I was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but that's only UK centric. But I think the grant that Maya's mentioned, the UCLA, the new one, the Modern Endangered Archives, that's a good one. But yeah, otherwise, I actually also don't know. I think what Farah's suggesting is probably your best bet, to kind of really go for, to find niches that your corpus could serve, and then kind of try and find people to fund maybe very specifically parts of that.
Yeah, you're more likely to get more money that way also, because there will be, if you can align yourself with projects in universities and institutions, that will help you get more grants than a blanket digitization project.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Okay, I think
we should close. We have
Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure. Go for it.
Actually, I am also. I mean, it's more on the line of Chetan's work. I am also. I am from a PhD. I am looking at the at the intersection of history and literature in the early 20th century, primarily in Hindi literature. But so there, I have. I would not say digitized, but scanned at least around 50 novels, 50 historical novels, the earliest historical novels that were printed in Hindi, were published in Hindi. And right now I'm looking at ways to kind of prepare data sets so that I can do exciting things in distance learning, in distance reading. So I am, there is another thing that is kind of boggles my head, that not a lot of work has been done in Indian OCR for Indian languages. When you compare to I recently came across this exciting project, particularly for non-English, non-Anglophone languages, that is OpenITI. It works on Arabic. It's housed at, I think, University of Maryland in US and some university in Germany. So what they are doing is that they're curating data sets, digitally machine readable data sets for Arabic, and they are extending to other languages as well. So they have worked on an interesting model, which is on an interesting OCR, which is quite easy to use for humanists, that is Kraken. So I am right now I'm interested in, because CDAC has done a lot of work, and they have kind of released a lot of documents which might be useful for scholars of print cultures in India. So is there a viable way to prepare datasets, curate datasets out of these archives that CDAC has brought out, and prepare them in a way that might be useful for distant reading? Do you have any comments, any of you?
So I definitely do not, like, I mean, I kind of very vaguely know about CDAC's work. And I definitely don't know what they've done in other languages except Bangla. So in a terribly Bengali way. So
yeah, I am familiar
yeah.
mostly with Hindi work, Hindi and Urdu, not more than that.
So one thing that I would say, and I mean, this is something that we've always kind of advocated, is that if you have digitized these works and they're in the public domain, then please just put them on archive.org. You know, like, because then they become, you know, a resource.
They are on archive. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. They are on archive.org, but I am interested in ways that make them machine readable, so that you can
I think your
model them. You can
So I think just like, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you separately. But that's exactly the kind of challenge that we faced with 2 centuries of Indian print. And as I said earlier, Tesseract was pretty much a godsend. And so I think it works really well for Hindi, but as far as I know, Urdu, I don't. So you should be able to get something with that, get somewhere with that. But I'm really not the Hindi digitization person to go to, although I do know many people who might be able to help. So I can also point you towards that. That's true. Sorry, that wasn't very helpful.
Yep, I work mostly with Bond Digital Archives, so not so much digitization. So also a bad person to ask, but we can always find out. Yeah, there's nothing that can't be found out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I'm sorry that we can't be more specific. Okay, so I think we should wrap up.
We definitely should wrap up.
It's been almost 2 hours. But thank you so much for having us. I mean, this has been fun. Feel free to, I'm just putting my email address.
I will also put in my email in case you need to ask questions.
Yeah, please do kind of get in touch with us. I think I'll kind of maybe put it again in the chat. But it's really worth kind of getting involved with Milli, which is the very newly formed but really amazing kind of resource around archiving
all across India.
Yeah, so they had this really amazing kind of online conference a few months ago, which had archivists from all over the world speaking about all kinds of archives. And I think those recordings are available and online. So please feel free to look at them. It's a great educational resource. I think Venkat, as far as I know, we're trying to put a mailing list together as well. So try and sign up for that. But yeah, just drop us a line, any questions you have. I think we are both very passionate about more archivists in the world. So, happy to help. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Wow, we talked a lot.
Thank you, Padmini, Farah. Also, thanks to those who also, it was a wonderful workshop in that way that you also brought in other members who are into it and who also have shared, like Dibboduti Venkataganeshan and Pulu Manthoni, George. I thank all of you for taking part in this. You see, I was expecting a few more technical questions from those who are working on those archives, because my role on this is providing a space. I'm really not interested to go back and learn again. But of course, they are young scholars, they are doing it. So I was actually expecting more practical questions. Rather, what we have got is, which is not bad, of course, questions that came from their disciplinary background. Questions that are primarily ontological. And I don't know why this discussion about funding also happened. But anyway, thank you that you responded to all the questions. for me personally, it was not totally Greek, but almost Greek. But I think we need to go into it more and more as students of literature and students of culture. So I would really, I'll write to you so that we can also plan a few more workshops on different aspects where you can teach directly to our participants, which is more important, because this workshop gives me the idea, particularly those questions that came up, which are coming from our disciplinary background, which can be dealt with in digital humanities, which is fine. But also there is, we also need some technical training. Sure. If possible, I'll talk about that. If possible, we would really like to have you again to learn more. And of course, I think as you talked about your organization and what we are doing is also out of the institution. So maybe we can think of joint archiving.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I think at this moment in India, I think that's definitely what we want to do and need to do. I mean, that's why, you know, I mean, Amitesh was kind enough to let me invite other people as well, because, you know, I think it's something that everyone is very curious about. And there's, I think we just have to learn together and work together. That's the best way to do this. Right. Just to speak to the technical side of things, I mean, I'm more than happy to come back. I'm not going to speak for Farah, but there's also Bhanu and Dinesh who do amazing kind of, they do a lot of the technical kind of infrastructure. So the NCVS archive was built by them, for example. So we can definitely also bring them into the conversation. They've built India-centric open source kind of technical solutions, which I think is really important. So we'd be more than happy to put you in touch with them as well.
Yeah, in fact, I spoke to Bhanu and Dinesh today, and they volunteered to do it. So we are. I mean, I in fact am not the best. I can take you through something, but when you have technical glitches, it will be Bhanu who can help you solve them. So it is best as Bhanu does this workshop. In fact, I have worked on most of my archives with Bhanu and Dinesh, and they have been my technical pillars of strength. So. Yeah, I mean, it would be very helpful to have them if you are interested in getting to the technical nitty-gritties of it.
Sure, thank you. I would just like to add one point which came later when I talked about the non-availability of memes, etc. in other languages. I think there is another issue which that might be a limitation of our group itself, because. Okay. Because, you know, say, for example, my disciplinary training is in Bangla. So though I teach comparative Indian literature, I keep on scrolling Bengali, everything, and I read Bangla, and also I also teach Bangla. The group which we have now, all of them have come, except Abhishek, all of them have come from English discipline.
Sure.
Either English honors, right, or English MA, or English honors, comparative literature, Indian literature MA. Right. And given the cultural politics we have and as students what we went through, I am not sure how many of our scholars really read a local newspaper every day.
Right, sure.
So in our group, we'll discuss about that, and maybe then
again, crowdsourcing might be a way forward. I mean, as I said, and you know, so say the kind of work that Paul does. I mean, I think there are also increasingly people who are working in the digital ethnography space across languages. So you know, maybe it's just a question of creating a network of people to contribute to one space, and you know, people can pull from that and create their own archives, or you know, kind of catalog everything together. Yeah, the possibilities are endless. Okay. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I now
thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. I will now end this meeting.
Yeah. Oh, you are the host, right?